The Titanic was a monumental ocean liner, the first of its kind. It was bigger than any of its sister ships, it held more people, and it was faster. It was marketed as unsinkable, which is ironic now because it is one of the most influential shipwrecks in the world.
As the Titanic set off on its maiden voyage, the 2,240 passengers on board had no idea of the imminent disaster that was mere hours away, a night that would take 1,517 lives, leading it to be the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history.
The catastrophe was the result of a collision with an iceberg. The ship was speeding through dangerous waters despite many warnings and subsequently sideswept a massive iceberg. Life magazine said that, upon impact, the berg only punctured the boat in a half-dozen spots, about 12 square feet. Yet it was enough to make the ship descend into the depths of the Atlantic forever.
The ship had 3 classes: first class, which included some of the wealthiest people alive at the time, second class comprising a mostly middle-class people, and third class, or the steerage, which consisted of poor people and many immigrants who took a great risk to find better life in America. Many can agree that the classes were not treated equally, and even survivors of the wreck recognized the lower class's rights being neglected, causing an unfair advantage for survival. During an interview for Life magazine, survivor Michael Navratil says, "There was a vast difference in people's wealth on that ship, and I realized later that if we hadn't been in second class, we'd have drowned. The people who came out alive often cheated and were aggressive. The honest didn't stand a chance."
The Titanic was racing through iceberg-infested waters. The ship was warned to go slower, yet it ignored 20 ice warnings, as stated by the Hamna Sadiqui website, and continued to go at an unsafe speed. Additionally, according to the National Archives, there were supposed to be many lookouts on deck, watching for ice. Yet for unknown reasons, there was not enough. However, the biggest issue was that there was not a sufficient number of lifeboats aboard for all the passengers. There were 20 lifeboats on the ship, which was only enough for about half the people aboard.
The lack of lifeboats was the biggest reason that so many people died, but also the lifeboats that were there were not loaded properly. The first few lifeboats were not loaded to the fullest capacity, and in a document from Bowdoin College, it mentions that on the Titanic, Captain E.J. Smith gave specific women and children first orders to the first and second officers, each of whom was responsible for filling lifeboats. Officer Lightoller on the port side of the ship took this order to mean women and children only, resulting in lifeboats being lowered prior to reaching full capacity. The repercussion of this was that there were numerous invaluable seats on the Titanic that were wasted.
Another fatal issue on the Titanic was the fact that the crew was not suitably trained on what to do during an emergency. The National Archives points out that the White Star Line is responsible for not properly training the crew for evacuation, leading to the launching of partially filled lifeboats and the loss of even more lives. This elucidates how crucial safety precautions like preparing the crew for emergencies is very important and was a pivotal mistake on the Titanic. A reason for these safety oversights could be because the Titanic was marketed as unsinkable, and the consequence of this ironic branding was that it caused nobody to expect or even consider that the ship might sink, so they did not properly plan for the possibility of a crash.
Most of the fatalities on the Titanic came from the third class. This is partly due to the location of the third class, or the steerage. The area that the third-class passengers were in during the collision was much farther away from the lifeboats compared to the other 2 classes, making it so that it took the third-class passengers much longer to make it to the lifeboats. By the time they got to the deck, most of the boats had already departed, leaving countless stranded.
The Titanic is a topic that is generally well known, but the part that doesn't often get mentioned is the prejudice and inequality that was very prominent on the ship. This prejudice and inequality led to basic human rights for safety being denied. The first-class passengers had the highest possibility of survival, a 62% chance. The second class had a 41% chance of survival, and the third class only had a 25% chance. This data shows the discrimination between classes because there was such a big decline in survival rates.
The first class had a much higher probability of surviving the wreck because they are more likely to make it to the lifeboats. The first class was prioritized over the lower classes, but in a scenario where everybody has equal rights, no one would be prioritized. Because the lower classes were not in the lifeboats, they succumbed to floating in the ice-cold waters, waiting for someone to rescue them. The issue is that the boats were lowered without their full complement, did not make any effort to pick up passengers from the water. Consequently, only a small number of persons were saved from the water.
Additionally, there was intense discrimination of age and gender. If you were a female or a child, you were almost 50% more likely to live. The National Library of Medicine writes, females were more likely to survive than males, and the chances of survival declined with social class as measured by the class in which the passenger traveled. This explains how, the lower your class, the less likely you would make it out alive. However, if everyone on board had equal rights to safety, no one would have lost any loved ones because everyone would have evacuated safely. While there was an opportunity to save more people, it was not taken and many still unnecessarily perished. All of these unnecessary deaths could have been avoided if equal access to safety measures had been a priority. If everyone on board the ship had equal rights, then they all would have been safely evacuated, and there wouldn't be so much unfortunate backlash.
The crew had immense responsibility, not only to do their jobs, but to take care of the passengers. It was the staff's duty to make sure that every person that boarded their ship made it off safely, but they failed miserably. Wayne Hall, a professor from the University of Southern Australia, wrote, "I can only conjecture that the poorer survival of the third-class woman was a consequence of the lack of attention paid to third-class passengers by the crew. If no special effort was made to get third-class women to the boat deck, then the chances of men and women in third class being considered for a place in the lifeboats would have been more nearly equal than for men and women in the first class. The people from third class had a lower survival rate because they were not a priority to the crew."
The crew was ineffective at keeping everyone safe because they didn't do their jobs properly. There weren't ice lookouts, the crew did not load the lifeboats correctly, and if they had, it could have saved countless more lives. Ultimately, the crew should have been aware that they were in dangerous waters, and they should have never hit the iceberg in the first place. But because these simple things did not happen, we are left to suffer the consequences.
Many were angry about the unnecessary deaths, and many were confused about how something to this extent could have happened. People wanted answers, and they turned to the president. Letters from 1912 kept in the National Archives to President William H. Taft from citizens who were angered, inspired, or moved by the loss of the Titanic. They demanded an investigation into the sinking and shared ideas for the prevention of such disasters in the future. The authorities investigated the disaster as soon as possible to gather facts relating to this disaster while they were still vivid.
Hundreds of claims were filed against White Star Line, totaling to around $16 million. Many of the claims were witnesses describing their mental and physical injuries thrust upon them that night, such as Anna McGowan of Chicago, Illinois, was unable to get on a lifeboat and jumped from the Titanic onto a lifeboat and sustained permanent injuries from the fall, shock, and frostbite. The experience left her in a state of nervous prostration and unable to provide for herself. Even though there was prominent evidence of negligence on the ship, their liability was protected by an act to limit the liability of ship owners and for other purposes, which was a law enforced in 1851. Essentially, this law states that if the company was unaware of negligence on the ship, then the ship was limited only to the liability of the passenger fares, the salvage materials from the wreck, and the amount paid for cargo. So among the 706 survivors and the families of the 1,517 deceased, the amount they were entitled to was about $91,805. Later that year, White Star Line filed a petition to limit their liability against the claimants. White Star later claimed that the catastrophe was an inevitable accident. The only way to remove the limits on the company's liability would be to prove that the captain and crew were negligent and the ship's owners had knowledge of this fact.
The lawsuits would also make the wealth gap on the ship very prominent. A prime example would be Charlotte Drake Cardezza, who occupied the most expensive stateroom on the ship. In total, all of her belongings that were lost accounted for a sum of over $100,000. Her most expensive item was a diamond ring worth $20,000. On the other hand, Yum Hee of Hong Kong filed a claim for only $91. His most expensive item was a suit that cost approximately $12.50. This wide gap of wealth on the ship is an excellent illustration of the class differences and social standards on the ship.
Even though it may sound like it, everything about the Titanic isn't all bad. First, the sinking of the Titanic sparked the creation of sonar, because when people were desperate to find the remains of the ship, they needed to find a better way to look underwater. The U.S. Coast Guard was searching for the wreck, and they wanted a better way to search the deep parts of the ocean, and this led to the creation of sonar.
Another silver lining from the story of the Titanic is that it offers valuable lessons that we can learn from in more ways than one. The tragedy has caused new laws to be created, like the Radio Act of 1912 and the International Ice Patrol, both of which make sailing in open ocean safer so that another maritime disaster is less likely to happen. Laws like these make the world all the more safe for future generations. On top of that, we can look back on the story of the Titanic disaster, and we can learn from the mistakes of people back then. We can remorse over the deaths of everyone that died, while making promises to ourselves to do the right thing if something like this ever occurs again. We can look at the story of the Titanic with sorrow and anger or even indifference because it does not directly affect anyone today, or we can choose to learn from it. The biggest takeaway from the Titanic is that it is paramount to set aside bias and social norms to help others in times of need.